Wow, there's a lot going on today. There's Ukraine war news. There's internal Ukraine news. There is yield curve news. I guess I'll start with, because I don't want to be accused of being a Russian shill and not talking about news that, might be good for Ukraine. There was the raid on Belgorod, where the Ukrainians apparently were able to fly in and blow up oil, I guess you'd call it an oil stockpile or an oil reservoir, something. It was a bunch of giant stationary tankers. It was somewhere where the Russians were storing oil, which presumably would go to fueling their army in Ukraine. All of that fuel has to be moved from Russia into Ukraine, and obviously with any mechanized army, if you can cut off the fuel supply, they're pretty much dead in the water. But unfortunately for the Ukrainians, I don't think that this would be like a knockout blow. At least that's not the understanding that I've gotten from listening to other people who are pretty reasonable on the facts of this war. It does not seem like this is going to be a massive game changer to turn the tide of the war. Like the Republican army in the Spanish Revolution, it appears that the Ukrainian armed forces are very much divided, and therefore will likely be conquered in due time by the Russians. In fact, if the Russians are able to successfully encircle the different groupings of Ukrainian fighters and cut them off from the outside, well, then they effectively are also cut off from fuel. But you don't really need fuel if you can't move anywhere because you're surrounded now, do you? Now, additionally, today Zelensky fired two men who are being described as generals, but apparently they were both high-ranking officials with the SBU, which is like the Ukrainian, modern equivalent of the KGB. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, most of the former Soviet republics renamed the KGB to be something else. Of course, notably Belarus did not, which is one of the reasons I've always wanted to visit Belarus. It seems like a less scary version of North Korea. Like, you go there, and it looks like it's still kind of the Cold War. You still have all of the soldiers that still wear their hammer and sickle hats, and you still have the KGB, and you still have the same Soviet-era dictator. Not that I think that's a good thing. It's just that I love history. So to go to a place that kind of seems like it's in the past, very much like North Korea's. North Korea seems to be like a time capsule of the Stalinist era. But anyway, I'm getting off topic. Back to the SBU, the Ukrainian KGB. Zelensky fired not only the Kherson station chief for the SBU, but also I guess the overall head of the SBU, or he's being described as the chief of the main branch, which I just assume means like he's their equivalent of the director of the CIA. And he labeled them both traitors. So he basically said that the head of the Ukrainian secret police was in fact a Russian stooge or a Russian spy. I don't know. I find that pretty funny that he's only figuring that out, if that's in fact true, a month into the war. Now, I'm sure there's much more to the story than we're being told. But just that headline it's so clownish. A month into the war, you find out that your top spy is in fact a Russian double agent? Now, this isn't impossible. From what I understand, the SBU is still heavily penetrated by the Russians. There seems to have been, sort of a lagging. Since this is a direct successor to the old KGB, it seems like a lot of the people with the same attitude kind of stick around. People who like the Soviet Union, who like Russia, tend to be a part of this organization, and there seems to be a lot of Russian-aligned cliques within the SBU. Now, I don't have anything direct on it. That's just what I've heard in the past. Before Zelensky made this announcement, that's what I've heard. But if, in fact, the top guy at the SBU was one of these, Russian-aligned spies, that's a pretty big deal. That's pretty interesting. It makes you wonder how much intelligence could he have been passing to the Russians. If you remember, we also had that incident where one of the Ukrainian negotiators in the first, talks with the Russians since the beginning of the war, one of those negotiators was killed by the Ukrainians in Belarus where they were negotiating. And their reason for summarily executing him was that he was also a Russian spy, one of their own negotiators. Now, also after that, who knows which any of this might be, disinformation or just trying to fog of war stuff. But after that, then we saw reports that, in fact, this guy that they killed was a double agent, and that he was working with Russia, but he was actually like a triple agent, in that he was a Ukrainian spy who infiltrated Russia, and then was sent by Russia as a spy into Ukraine. And but he actually was betraying the Russians. But the Ukrainians, Ukrainians who weren't in on that caught him and saw, oh, you're a Russian spy. Boom, Who knows if any of this is true? But the overall theme here is that there seems to be a lot of distrust within the Ukrainian current government. They seem to think that there are Russians in their midst, and that you can't necessarily trust everyone. They're not all certain that they're on the same side. And psychologically, that can really put a big drain on you during a time of war. I mean, it's stressful enough being in a war and having, and being under attack from an outside force, but then to wonder about, where there's a fifth columnist behind every blade of grass potentially, or behind every desk, when you come into work in the morning. That will really eat at you, especially when these potential fifth columnists look like you, they talk like you, they have a name very much like you, but nevertheless they still might not be just like you. So that's a whole nother dimension of this conflict that I really hadn't thought about before. That the Ukrainians have to worry about this, and I think very clearly are quite paranoid about it. If they're summarily executing people, and and now they're finding out, or at least they're claiming, they at least claim to believe that high-ranking officials within the Ukrainian security state were in fact Russians. And we see what they do to Russians when they capture them out in the field. People who are honest Russians, guys with Russian flag patches on their arm, conscripts, who don't even want to be there. They get tied up, laid down on the ground, and shot in their kneecaps. Civilians with Russian-sounding names get shrink-wrapped to light poles, and then whipped or publicly humiliated, or both. And so I can't imagine what terrible things they might do to someone who they thought was one of them, who was serving along with them in this war against the Russians, only to find out that they are in fact a soldier for Russia. Tell you what, it's stories like this that really make me glad that I've never had to live through a war. Now, I have no good segue for this, but I do want to mention what's going on in the United States. We do have an inverted yield curve now. Something interesting that I hadn't noticed is that apparently only the 2 years seems to, it's only inverted back to the 2 year. The shorter term stuff has not inverted, meaning that I believe what's currently going on is that you have the 3 month, which is the shortest term treasury, that it carries the lowest yield. That's what you'd expect because, you have a risk premium and, a time premium, or the longer you lend your money out, the higher annual rate of interest you would demand, because you're having to give up access to that money for a longer period of time. It's, it's basic logic. You don't have to think about it too hard. Longer term stuff, typically, all else equal, a longer term loan should yield a higher interest rate. And so, as you would expect, the 3 month treasury is the lowest, and then gradually, as you go from the 3 month all the way up to the 2-year. There's a few different maturation lengths, durations, I should say, leading up to the 2-year, like the 1 year. They all are increasing, and then it increases all the way up to the 5-year, I believe. So, the 5-year, if you look through the first 5 years of the yield curve, 5-year, as you would expect, it yields the highest rate of return, then the 2-year, then the 1-year, then the 3-month. But after you get past the 5-year, yields start going down again. The 10-year is in fact below both the 2-year and the 5-year. And the 30-year is also, I believe it's higher than the 10-year, but it's below the 2-year and the 5-year. And so this is an inverted yield curve, but it's an interesting shape that we don't often see. Normally you would expect the 3-month to be where it's increasing first, because as the recession is expected, normally you get a steepening at the front end of the curve. Actually, steepening is the wrong word, because steepening is when it's uninverting. But you get the inversion starts at the front, okay? The 3-month starts to rise. And so you get to a point, where the 3-month might have a higher yield than the 1-year, and then eventually the 3-month will have a higher yield than the 2-year, and then the 5-year, and then the 10-year, and so on. An inverted yield curve means that it's peaking at the front of the curve instead of at the end of the curve. A normal yield curve, should be relatively smooth, and the yield should gradually rise as you go out in further duration bonds. And likewise, an inverted yield curve, when the yield curve starts to invert, you see yields start to rise at the front and start moving forward. And so you get that slope, reverse. But this is a bit different this time. We're seeing yields peak at the 5-year. It's going up all the way through the 5-year, and then past the 5-year, it's going down. And so I'm going to have to do, I guess, a bit of a deeper dive into what's going on with the bond market to figure out why that is, because that's not what I'm used to, because it was weird to hear that the 2-year, that, the 2s and the 10s inverted before the 3-month and the 10s. That's what I would have expected to see first, and I never saw headlines. And so when I heard the 2s and the 10s inverted, I thought, wow, how did I miss the 3 months? And I hadn't. But nevertheless, yield curve inversion, as far as I'm concerned, it still signals the same thing, even though it looks a little strange this time. I'm going to dig deeper to try and figure out why that is. Yield curve inversion is still your recession signal from the bond market. That hasn't changed. That's always been the case. People said the last time that it inverted, it didn't end up doing, nothing came of that. Well, then guess what? We got the Wu flu and the shutdowns and all that. So even if you don't want to give credit to the bond market for predicting that, well, the bond market was forecasting recession, and a recession came, okay? You can't just say that it didn't count because the recession was a result of the Wu flu, or I should say it's a result of the Wu flu giving governments an excuse to destroy the economy. I mean, that's as dumb as saying, oh, well, the yield curve is, isn't right this time. The only reason why we might have a recession is because of the Putin price hike. So the last bit of news I'd like to discuss is something I almost never talk about, and that is the White House press secretary. But a lot of people, I think, have the wrong perspective on the news that Jen Psaki is leaving the White House to go work at MSNBC. I believe Jen Psaki previously, before working for the White House this time, I think she was at Fox News, being one of the Fox News lefties. She might have been at CNN, but I thought it was Fox. But I don't know. I'll never know because I don't watch these stupid cable channels. I haven't since like middle school. That's when I outgrew the discourse on cable news, to be honest. I got to about 8th grade, and it was really 9th grade is when I totally quit, because I did watch through the 2012 election. But then after that, it was just like, you know what, this really is some low IQ debate that these people engage in. And now that there's not an election going on, there's no reason to want to watch these things. Now, of course, years later, we have much better online election coverage. But anyway, I don't want to get bogged in talking about cable news. That's also a terrible topic. The White House press secretary has left. It is, I guess she's been there a little over a year, because the president would have been inaugurated in January 2021. It is now April 1st, 2022. So she's been there a little over a year. And people are going, oh my gosh, look, Psaki's leaving. She just can't bear lying for Biden anymore. It's gotten too bad. She can't spin it. She doesn't have it in her. Yeah, she probably doesn't. But breaking news, that happens to every press secretary. Because the job of a press secretary is to lie to propagandists. They're the chief propagandist of the United States. Their job is to go on TV and lie on behalf of the president. They've all done it. What's his name? Tony Snow, Dana Perino, Sarah Sanders, the guy that played the Easter Bunny, gosh, what was his name? Sean Spicer, him, Jay Carney, the guy who before him who ended up being the chairman at the DNC later, something Gates, not Robert Gates, that was the Secretary of Defense. Kayleigh McEnany, I think those are all press secretaries. And, well, actually, I guess you can't say the same thing about McEnany because the administration ended, I think, while she was still press secretary. But anyway, you have these people who come and go as press secretary. Because it is a tough job to get up every day and lie in front of cameras. You know, it's just, that's tough on your soul. You know, even if you're dead inside, like most of these people are, it still does get at you to know that you're lying that hard, because you have to tell some pretty bad lies, some really, really obvious lies when you're a press secretary. So what I'm getting at is that the fact that Jen Psaki's leaving is not a sign that, oh my gosh, the Biden administration is spiraling. You know, the rats are fleeing the sinking ship. It's not indicative of that at all. That might be the case, but this is not evidence of it. You know, it is not sufficient to make that case, because all press secretaries leave. You know, a year as press secretary, that's a perfectly normal tenure. Remember, what's his name? Trump had 3 press secretaries in 4 years. I think Sarah Sanders was the longest of the 3. I believe he had 3. He might have even had an extra one that I'm not remembering. And so, you know, what's the benefit of being a press secretary? Does it pay particularly well? You know, if it really is, you know, really tough on your soul, if it is, you know, just hard to get up there and lie all the time. Why do people do it? Well, it's probably for the reasons like, you know, you can see with Jen Psaki. She got a deal. She's going to work at MSNBC now. She elevated her profile. Remember, before this, she was press secretary for the State Department, I want to say. Which, I mean, that probably is even a worse job than being the press secretary for the White House. But out of that, she got her cable news contributorship after the Obama administration. She was able to work as a talking head for 4 years. And then when Biden came in, she got a promotion. She became the White House press secretary. And now she's going to have an even better cable news gig than she did during the 4 years of the Trump administration. And so that's a good motivation for people to do that. I mean, look at Dana Perino. She has now a multi-decade-long career at Fox News because she was George W. Bush's press secretary. Dana Perino is not an interesting person. You ever listen to her talk? I remember her from you know, the days many, many years ago when I would watch Fox News, and she was not an interesting person. She doesn't have anything interesting to say. She contributes nothing to public discourse. Yet she's been able to have a long and distinguished media career, which all, you know, is because she was a White House press secretary. Hell, look at Sarah Huckabee Sanders. She's running for governor of Arkansas. Nobody knew who Mike Huckabee's daughter was before she was the press secretary. And because, you know, she got up there and she was a particularly aggressive press secretary, you know, she has clout now with Trump supporters. And obviously, in the state of Arkansas, the vast majority of people are Trump supporters. Even though that is the Bill Clinton state. So there's not a whole lot, there's a lot of benefit to becoming a White House press secretary, but there's not a whole lot of benefit in remaining a White House press secretary once you've, you know, established yourself and built a bit of a name recognition. You know, it's a stepping stone. It's something to put on your resume, but it's not a job that, you know, is particularly fun for anyone, I don't think. So, with all that said, I know that was a lot of topics for today, and I didn't get it. What was it, like 4? But with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.